Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all having a lovely Sunday. Today we are talking about mental health and fertility. So it was World Mental Health Day yesterday. Obviously, here at Parla, we talk about mental health all the time. It's completely interlinked with a reproductive journey, struggles with fertility, baby loss, and our reproductive health and hormone health in general. So whilst it was World Mental Health Day yesterday, it's something that we're obviously always talking about and want to continue to talk about all the time. So our guest this evening is someone who is a real change maker in the fertility space. Natalie Silverman is the host of the Fertility Podcast, and she is also a training and has become a coach to help women on their fertility journey as well. She's going to tell us all about that because, again, it's really, really founded in mental health. She's just joining us now, so I'll invite Natalie. We can start our chat. Here she is. Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm trying to compensate from having a woolly hat on today. This is hair that you have to commit to a woolly hat with and then figure out something else later.
No, you look fab. You're bringing a bit of glam to the Sunday evening. I am not, so I appreciate the
Well, you're being very kind.
So I was just sort of giving a bit of introduction to what this live's all about. Obviously, it was World Mental Health Day yesterday. There was so much kind of on social media and all around. But obviously, with Parla, I know what you do, mental health is a sort of 365-day-a-year topic that you're really passionate about. And I think that I was just sort of saying it's just so interlinked with our reproductive health, from hormones and periods to fertility journeys and loss. You know, the two, you can't really have one without the other. And so I'm really glad that we're getting to have this conversation this evening. So do you want, I gave a little bit of a brief introduction. I said you're a bit of a change maker in the fertility space, and we're really, really pleased to have you as part of the Parla community. But for anyone that maybe doesn't know you, do you want to give a bit of an overview as to kind of your journey into this space?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Coni. And really chuffed to be able to have this chat with you. And I love what Parla are doing. So it's nice to connect, which is what I kind of have been doing whilst making this podcast. So I am Natalie Silverman. My story is that I was a radio presenter full-time. I was on Heart doing a breakfast show when I found out I needed to have fertility treatments, which I had whilst being jolly and upbeat doing a breakfast radio show. And I was already working in audio. So I was a bit of a podcast geek a good 6 years ago. And once successfully pregnant, decided that actually I could use what I'd been through and what I was doing to make a podcast, because I couldn't find a British sounding one. There was some American ones. And made the Fertility Podcast. And 6 years on, I'm still making the Fertility Podcast and talking to all sorts of different experts about all sorts of different topics. We've covered over 9,000 hours worth of conversations about this. And the podcast is listened to in over 90 countries. So it's shown how vast this conversation is. And as well as expert chats, we share people's stories. And I never imagined there'd be so much to say, but there is, and there continues to be. And basically, as it's kind of grown, when I went through my treatment, I wasn't part of the community that there is now. And the way the community's grown is amazing. And from the kind of questions that were coming my way, as well as being able to signpost people to experts, I decided I wanted to be able to help people more, which I know we'll talk more about. But that's why I spent the last just over a year learning this specific formula to help people with their emotional well-being and mental health. So that's in a nutshell me and what I'm doing. And the podcast, in essence, is, if you listen to podcasts, you'll know it's just a really, I think, unique and intimate way to hear stuff about something that you're obviously wanting to know more about, which is why I love that the podcast space, especially around infertility, has now really kind of grown since I started doing what I was doing.
And I think it's interesting that you kind of say that I feel like the States, they're slightly ahead of us in this maybe conversation at least, or the content that they're producing. You know, and I think you're right. Like when you started this sort of 5-6 years ago, I think the conversation in the UK has come a long way.
Yeah, massively.
Which, you know, work like communities like Parla and the stuff that you're doing has played a huge role in that. But we've still got a long way to go. But it's getting there, which is really cool. So, I mean, obviously mental health is what we want to talk about, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your personal experience with your kind of fertility journey, if people aren't aware of your situation, and specifically how the kind of challenges you faced from a mental and emotional capacity.
Well, when I found out I needed to have treatment, my best friend had been through IVF. She'd had 3 rounds and had twins, and so I had somebody straight away that I could ask questions to. And she was like, don't look at any of the forums, don't go online. And I didn't. I totally listened to her. And when we went through kind of being told that we needed treatment, we weren't dealt with in a very good way, and it had a real impact. We were told on the 23rd of December, so it affected Christmas, and both my other half and I, you know, dealt with it very differently. I had my mate I could instantly go to. He didn't have anybody he could talk to, and so straight away it became very clear that dealing with something like this affects everybody very differently. And I know that her support was a big thing for me in terms of knowing that I needed somebody to talk to about it. I think the one thing I'd say is that we had success first time with our treatment, and I again was very naive when we went through treatment what people go through, because I just didn't get involved in the community. I now have spent 6 years in it, and I'm very aware of all that everybody goes through. And in terms of the whole mental health, I've also learned how it continues to stay with you, which again is why the podcast continues to talk about this stuff. And I've made a point of kind of being able to offer more support with the content that we make and the way that I work within the community that I'm in.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting kind of gateway into it, in terms of, like you said, you had someone who'd already been through it. Had you not had that person, that probably would have been a completely different experience for you. Totally. And I know that the podcast has been my kind of therapy. I've much more than my other half has had access to. I've immersed myself in this conversation and learned so much more about it, which isn't something that he had and has only kind of heard secondhand if he's wanted to, So I think, and again, the way that the support and access is for men and women is very different, and something, if you're listening to this and just in this space trying to understand more about trying to conceive and struggling, I think it's important to say that the support for men is there, but I think there's a real reluctance for that conversation to happen, which is something that we're trying to encourage more. Yeah, definitely. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of male side of things as well, because I think you're right. The community aspect there is so far behind where we are, and we've still got a long way to go. So it's way back there. Yeah. I mean, how did you find, so you said, you started the podcast after you'd conceived. So you kind of maybe were over that hurdle of uncertainty and those sorts of emotions. Yeah. But how I guess me personally and Parla, our kind of ethos is sharing and talking. And, whenever we write about mental health, it's like, talk about it, open up. And that's great advice, but that can be really difficult to do, to start doing at least. So how easy or hard did you find opening up about this? And like you said, was it sort of triggering that even after the fact, then you may be having these conversations, emotions are coming back up for you? What was that experience like? Well, I spent the first year of this podcast anonymous because I didn't know how to talk about it. I was talking about it, but I didn't want to totally put my name to it. I wasn't sharing it on my personal social platforms, and so that in itself was quite a big thing that took me a long time to realize. And I'd get to know more people that were listening, and they'd say, you talk about this taboo topic and you're not telling us who you are. And then I kind of learned that actually that was a kind of shielding thing that I was doing. And I think however you share in this space, you've got to have that element of self-protection, which I'm really aware of from my own experience. And I think once I decided, which a year into the podcast, I decided to be like, hello, I'm Natalie, and own it and come out. Yeah. And
it then instantly became even more of two things. It became something I was very proud of, but it also became like the burden of what I was saying became a bit more involved, because now I was really being me. And then as our own kind of journeys continued, because we haven't had further treatment, and I know we'll talk more about that, about different decisions that we've made, I was then sharing that in what I was doing, and then realizing the emotional toll of it. Because wherever you're at, and I think that's you can sometimes feel like your story might not be as difficult as somebody else's, or you might not have had as much heartache and loss as somebody else's. I don't think that then means that you don't warrant support and guidance. Whatever you have been through or are at in terms of trying and struggling to conceive is relevant and valid. And I think that's something also that I was starting to learn about, these lengthy journeys people were on, and being like, gosh, I had it easy, and am I right to be talking, you know, all these things. But every way in which you can talk and share and support helps. And I think that that's something that, you know, is a really worthwhile thing to think in this kind of conversation.
But it's the complexity of the emotions that I think, you know, as you're sort of describing, I think there's a lot of that when you're on a fertility journey. There is the shame, there is the guilt, there is, like you said, maybe guilt that you're not in as bad a situation as someone else, you know, and how you sort of navigate that. And then there is the sort of grieving process, which can happen even if it's, I shouldn't say even if, but you know, you could have a baby loss, but then you could also have a failed IVF round, and you still grieve for that. You know, you still have grief at different things. And I think there's such a cocktail of emotions that if you're not vocalizing it, that can just really be a lot to weigh down on your own mind. And
when you talk about this idea of grief and bereavement, the fact that you're unable to have a baby naturally in itself is a valid element of the grieving process, because we're all brought up to think that we are going to get pregnant. We're not, you know, we're only learning about the gap in the fertility education space in terms of, you know, what conversation is had in schools and stuff. So that whole transition, that you're not just going to wake up and be like, oh, I'm pregnant, like you see in the movies, you know, that
reveal, and the, like, you know, telling people. And because I always think about that if you've gone through loss, then you probably are like, the telling people you're pregnant just completely changes, because, you know, you're maybe scared, or you're sort of, we think we're pregnant, but we don't know. And even being robbed of that joy is
well, the conversation in terms of baby loss that we're not meant to tell until 12 weeks is something that there's been really interesting conversations about that, and how that can have such a negative effect if you do suffer a loss, that
your support network's not there.
Totally.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, and I guess you kind of touched on that earlier, and I think, like you said, just different things happening. And obviously you have one child, and we talked before, you know, that in itself was a process of, okay, we're having one child, fine. Can you talk a bit about what we spoke about your embryos and the decisions that you've made in terms of moving forward, and again, how that was something else that impacted your mental well-being?
I think that decision is the one that has been the biggest shift for me in terms of understanding what you need to do with your own mental health. And we, at the start of this year, donated our remaining embryos, had 3 to science. And the process of getting to that took me personally a lot of counselling conversations. I was the one that was driving it with my other half, in that we were we had a period of time where storage was covered, and then each year you have to pay a storage fee. And between the pair of us, our lives were changing, and jobs were changing, and locations were changing, and we hadn't bought a house, and we were in this position where we were like, what does the future look like? And very difficult decisions have to be made about the reality of what our life looked like. And I started this process of, we need to make a decision about this, because it wasn't as straightforward as we were going to have one and then we were going to have another. And I also, having had a very successful experience of IVF and then cast myself into this world of lots of failure, was extremely apprehensive about going through treatment again. And the long and short of of a conversation that I've shared on my podcast, and I don't want to fill up all the time because it's quite long-winded, was that I sought out a lot of support, and it ultimately had implications counselling to make the decision to donate the embryos to science, because I was 36 at the time of having them frozen and wasn't able to donate them to another couple, which also wasn't something that my husband and I felt that we could do. And we had, having used our kind of head over hearts, had worked on not having further treatment and looking at our family unit as 3. So made the decision, but it was and has been the hardest decision that I've made in this whole infertility experience. And that's something that I've worked very hard on, my own emotional well-being and understanding all of these different things, of what a decision like this enables rather than doesn't enable. And I've been quite vocal about the language, and you were very good at saying one child, not just one child, or only one child. And I think a lot of that is society's way of talking about these things. And I think if you're in a place of having treatment for your own, again, well-being and mental health, think about what it looks like, the whole picture, because I don't think we did. And I think that if we had have done, and it's a difficult one, because when you're just trying to have success at the start, do you want to be confusing things with what you're going to do further down? You just want to get that, you just want to get your baby. But yeah, it's definitely been something that has been extremely hard and challenging. It's still something that stays with me, and it's something that encouraged me and guided me to learn more about our emotional well-being, which is, again, the work I do now is so relevant. And I think it's, whenever I've talked about it on here or in any of my other communities, people always talk about this limbo feeling that they have of not knowing what to do, and people going at home stressing at night. And it's a really difficult one that we need to talk about more, because I think you need to talk it through with somebody before you can't rush that decision of further treatment, not further treatment, all the things that could happen.
And I think that's, until you immerse yourself in the world of fertility, you probably just wouldn't even, and even you were in that, and you don't necessarily think or emotionally prepare yourself for that phase of it, because there are these junctures along the way. And I think, and you mentioned fertility education, something I'm really, really passionate about is, it's wrong that women and couples, we're just sort of told, you'll do this and then you'll get pregnant, and that's that, because then you end up with all these people in their 30s and 40s or even 20s being like, oh my gosh, I didn't think this was they just haven't got the emotional language even to kind of navigate these challenges. And actually they're so common, sadly, that what it should not be, this is the normal way and everything else, you'll figure that out when you get there. I think it should be conversations we're having a lot earlier on in life, and we should enter a road to parenthood bearing in mind that it could go this way, it could go that way, and these are maybe how we'll manage that. You mentioned your work, and I'm really interested to know a bit more about it. So it's the Freedom Fertility Formula, is that correct? And is that something that you decided to go down to become, a specialist and a coach from, your time on the podcast and all kind of people you were interacting with and stories you were hearing?
Yeah, I felt, to be honest, that I had a duty of care to be able to offer more, because whenever I'd be contacted, I'd signpost people either to an episode, or in my closed Facebook group, there'd be experts that I'd tag in who were kind of my ambassadors. And a year ago, I started co-hosting the podcast with a lovely lady called Kate Davis, who is a fertility nurse. And so I also was having her input more, but I just wanted to find something else that I could do and offer. And I knew I didn't have the headspace or the kind of time in my world, because I also do I do voiceover work as well as all the podcasty stuff. So it was needed to be something I could do, basically. And I can't remember how I found this lady called Danny Griffiths, who created the Freedom Fertility Formula, but I did. She popped up somewhere and we had a conversation about what it was she did, and I told her what I was looking to do. And so I started training and going through the process with her formula, which is in essence a 7-step formula which teaches you how to become more emotionally aware. So the whole idea of it is that there's no guarantees when you're trying to conceive of a baby at the end. That's not the point of it. But the impact that this has on your emotional well-being is so vast. The different ways in which it affects your world, from your work to your friends to your family to decisions that you make. And so many people stop doing things because they're waiting to see what happens. They're waiting for their period, they're waiting for this test, they're waiting in the 2-week wait, they're waiting. And this whole idea of the formula is to live in the wait rather than waiting to live, and teaching you how to understand your emotions, to process your emotions. And it's a mixture of kind of coaching and CBT. There's visualizations in there, and it's over like a 3-month, ideally it's over a 3-month period. There's different ways to work. If, for example, I've worked with people who were heading into fertility treatment before we got to do the whole formula. Ideally it's for you when you're just starting to feel that this is a bit more tricky than you thought. You know, you've been trying and you just started to feel that this not getting pregnant is starting to get you down.
Yeah.
Like, obviously it's helpful for you if you're sadly having had a failed cycle and you feel, as people do sadly, feel abandoned by their clinic or whatever's going on. You might have suffered a loss. There's no right or wrong stage, but the ideal is earlier, so that you're better prepared. And I think the big thing with the conversations of some of the people that I've worked with is that if they haven't had success through, for example, an IVF cycle, they've said they felt able to handle the outcome, and they haven't spent the whole time in this heightened, stressed out emergency state, which is ultimately what we do when we're stressed. And I'm not saying don't be stressed and you'll get pregnant, and I'm not saying that stress stops you getting pregnant, but what any heightened state does is it tells your body that you're in danger. And so everything's going to be not as it should be. And what the formula teaches you to do is to find this kind of neutral place and to understand how it feels, to, because a lot of the time we don't understand feelings and we don't understand our emotions, and we're taught to not feel that or quash that down or put that away. And that's not helpful when we're trying to understand what's going on. And this mind-body connection ultimately is much more intertwined than we give it credit for.
100%. And I think it's, you know, when you experience mental health issues, be it anxiety or depression or stress, you know, it is physical. You know, it isn't just a mood thing. You know, there are physical ramifications of all of those things. And if you're starting off on a journey which, you know, like you said, could potentially be difficult, you need that emotional resilience. You need that baseline to be strong, so that the ups and the downs don't feel so dramatic and so overwhelming. Exactly. I suppose.
Exactly, because if you're going like this all the time, and someone's like, just try and feel better, and you're down here, it's much easier to get here than to get, and then you can work on here. And often when people around us that care for us and they can see that we're struggling, they say stuff that they think is going to help, which doesn't. And that idea of just knowing how to just try and getting back to a 0 on a scale to then try and get higher.
I think as well, it's what I love about, you know, the concept of that formula, and I guess the point at which, you know, it's recommended that you start that is, I think that it must, you know, I haven't had children myself yet, but from my understanding and just with life, I think when you have this end goal for anything in your mind, and you're putting all of your adrenaline in and all your hopes, and you're just like, I'm going to get to that point and then everything's going to be fine. If you get to that point and things aren't fine, the crash down from that's when you get those really difficult to manage emotions and mental health issues, because it is like you've just plummeted. Whereas if you're on that journey and you're like, okay, let's think about how this might feel, let's tune in with our emotions, let's try and get a strong baseline, I think it can really help those crashes not feel so monumental, and actually go, okay, I'm on this journey and this is part of that, and I can get back there.
We talk a lot about acceptance of the fact that you can't control this. You can't, but what you can learn is how to handle it, and that's a very different thing. You're not controlling your emotions, but you are emotionally in control. And I think a lot of, especially women who might be in their mid-30s, and career has been a big focus, and they've been very determined in what they want and getting what they want. Not to say men aren't the same, but when we're talking about, like, I suppose a woman's kind of approach to this, when it's like, and then I will get pregnant.
Yeah. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to get to this point of the job, and then I'll have the baby, and then I'll do this, and then I'll go back to work.
And when that doesn't all happen, it's this spiral, and there's such despair, and it's month by month because of the monthly reminder that you have as a woman, that what isn't happening. And of course, when there's all the conversations that shouldn't happen around you, have tried this, and have you done this, and my friend's uncle, all the nonsense that comes with people trying to help when it's not helpful. What we want is to be able to help people handle the day-to-day, because there's triggers everywhere.
Yeah. And I think the way, like you said, those kind of old wives' tales or the unsolicited advice is really triggering. And I think it's like the blessing and the curse of the conversation being opened up. It's amazing that now people understand that there are fertility issues. And if you're not pregnant, people might kind of, well, I think the classic is when you get married or something, and then people are like, so when are you having children? It's like, well, maybe we've actually been trying for the last year and it hasn't happened. And I think people are sort of slowly getting that that's not appropriate, but then they think it's totally okay to go the other extreme and go, let's talk about your potential infertility and let me give you all this advice. And I think there's got to be that balance of respect, but and the language used around it. I think, we spoke on the phone the other day, and I think there's so many pitfalls from medical professionals through to family and friends. And, is that something that you definitely noticed, is that the power of words and language and kind of appropriate conversations?
Oh, yeah. And I've really seen that conversation kind of skyrocket in the kind of TTC space. And I think, having heard from people that, they can phone up a clinic and be dealt with abruptly, and then see the fallout of that, of somebody that's had somebody go, well, we'll get to you, and disregard them when this is your everything. Equally, conversations at work. The work that I've also kind of got going on is this initiative called Fertility Matters at Work, which is an account you can follow on here. And when we've asked about people's experiences, and the idea is to educate employers on what's needed in terms of preconception care, and you as an employee on what you should have access to. And some of the comments we've had back when people have either had conversations or shown like written documents where this kind of treatment is compared to cosmetic surgery, or that there's a lifestyle choice around it. There's a real lack of understanding there, and so you can understand why people are so, again, just in disbelief when they're dealt with in this way, when it's something that it's so hurtful, and people are feeling so vulnerable and desperate about it. So I've sadly heard a lot of wrong conversations, and even in the conversations that I've had, I was talking with someone just the other day about saying things like, are you done yet? Is that all? Things like that. Are you done yet? Like you're a kind of machine, or is that you done? I think my friend had said that somebody had said to her, and if you're struggling and someone says something like that to you, or like I recently had somebody say to me, oh, have you just got one? Oh, easy. And I was like, bit my tongue, and you don't want to constantly be going, well, actually, and whatever's happened. But also, I think you want to have something that you want to say. And so one thing that I always talk about is kind of arming yourself with like a soundbite or something that you want as your answer, so that it almost, if somebody says something that's inappropriate to you, if you've got that little soundbite ready, it almost it lessens the impact of them on you, their comment to you. Sorry, something just popped up on my screen. It like loses the reactive power of,
it takes the sting out of it a little bit.
Yeah,
exactly. I think like words can be so powerful, and they can be positive or they can be negative, and I think that you also don't know where that person is at, and some days you might react in a completely different way, and some days someone might just catch you on a day when you're feeling really low and you're really struggling. That can just send you into a huge emotional tailspin. And I think it's why everyone just I think this is definitely that you know, all over Instagram and everywhere, especially yesterday, World Mental Health Day, it's, you know, be kind to each other. You know, you people are facing battles you don't know, but I think that needs to not just be, you know, stuff on social media. We really have to take that and kind of make that part of our life, because I think that sometimes people don't, and we've all done it, I'm sure. I mean, I can definitely look back and think, oh God, that was probably really insensitive of me. And I think once you're part of the club, if you like, of fertility issues, then you probably have a completely different a way of thinking about it. Whereas for people that don't know, they maybe don't quite understand just how hurtful those throwaway comments can be.
Exactly.
You know, I was speaking to one of our medical students who works with us last week, and even, you know, obviously doctors are incredible, the NHS does amazing work, and fertility clinics fantastic, but even then, it's, you know, the embryo is not viable. It's like, no, you're telling me I've lost my baby, but you're using words from like an A-level biology textbook. And I think, you know, we definitely need to, and she was saying, you know, she wants to work in OBGYN stuff, and she was like, I really want to be a doctor who thinks about the mental and emotional health stuff when it comes to babies and fertility, because, you know, there's time pressures and budgets and people, it's a bit of a conveyor belt sometimes. But I think anyone that's gone through fertility treatment, if they've had a doctor or a nurse who have taken the time to really consider their feelings, I think that really stays with people and has a huge impact. So I think it's hopefully more and more medical professionals kind of get with that as well.
That's really encouraging to hear. And I know colleagues that work within clinics having these conversations with clinic staff, because whilst there's obviously an element of empathy with the staff, not every single person that answers the phone might 100% get it. And whilst you hope that, you know, they are briefed on these types of things, it might not be the case. And so the more people there are having these conversations within the clinics and within the medical profession, but also students coming into it, I think that's really encouraging, because these things take time and it is a whole education piece. But, you know, just seeing how more mainstream this conversation is in the time that I've been doing what I'm doing, and the kind of people that get in touch with me for things, and, you know, we're in Baby Loss Awareness Week, and, you know, there's mainstream things on mainstream press happening this week that you know, I've been hearing about, and it's brilliant. Like I quite always kind of love it when, like, my dad sends me something that's coming up in the media that is to do with this, and I'm like, thanks Dad, I know already, but, you know, it's brilliant to see. And I know that, you know, I'm in a bubble and my family and friends know I'm in this bubble, but, and you forget when you're in this bubble. But I think what's brilliant is people are just accepting that, like mental health, which isn't obviously a day, it's all the time. But yesterday, like, I was listening to Six Music a lot, and was really loving how it was being captured on the radio and the different ways in which it was filtering through. And, you know, like with Baby Loss Awareness Week, it again is really encouraging to see where and how and what is being shared, and gradually, you know, all the ways that we now communicate, it will help more. It's helping already, but it's like this constant,
it's an evolution of, and it's like it's like a ripple effect. I feel like, you know, our mothers or our grandparents, like, this would not have been talked about. Like, you wouldn't have told people if you lost a baby, you wouldn't have told people if you were struggling to conceive. Now we're kind of at this, if you're in the club where everyone's really talking about it, but like you said, in the last few years, it's kind of filtered out of that echo chamber, I suppose, of predominantly women, which I think, you know, that's another issue, is mental health, infertility, and where they meet is not a woman's issue. It's not a female issue. It's an everyone issue of any gender, and especially if you're in a couple. And I think it's really interesting what you said about you and your husband having completely different experiences when you were facing your challenges, because you had already got someone who would talk to you openly and he didn't. And again, the TTC community is very female heavy. You know, women generally, not to generalize, but we talk a bit more about our emotions anyway. So like you said, when your dad sends you something, it's like, oh, it's filtering through to the guys now. Great. Maybe next time a man is struggling, they will have somewhere they feel is safe to talk
Yeah.
about their mental health and the experience that they're going through. Because I know, we spoke on the phone about our partners and their reactions to these sort of things, and it's quite interesting to see, isn't it? It's quite visceral for them, I think.
I think we also need to understand that men deal with it differently, and there's a Facebook group for men only, and I know over the last couple of years that's grown, really significantly, and there's a reason for it being men only, because the point is that men feel comfortable in talking about things, and a lot of the, as you mentioned earlier, the feelings of guilt and shame and just pride issues that come when men talk about this kind of stuff, that Facebook group is something that I know has really been beneficial to people. And there's the Easy Bit documentary, which is something that I was involved with, which had men talking about, like, to camera, talking about how they felt, their experiences, and it's an amazing watch, and it's on Vimeo, and you can watch it to just get that idea of how hard it is for men to talk about this. But on the other side of this conversation is that you can't force anybody to talk about it, and I don't think we should be like, oh, men need to talk more, they need to feel they can talk more. I think the fact is that a lot of men don't want to talk about this, and so it's how then do you reach those men. And I love that there are now male focused fertility podcasts. I've got a whole area of male fertility conversations, and whenever we share them, there's always a good reaction, and I'm always so pleased when a guy's got in touch and gone, it was brilliant hearing that expert explain, and it made me ask more questions in my appointment, because men often feel overlooked anyway. They don't get looked at literally in some of these consultations, and it's predominantly in the woman's name and all sorts of and especially now with all the lockdown restrictions, men aren't even allowed to go with their other halves. And I mean, I'm focusing much more on a heterosexual scenario here. But I just think even, the conversations I've had with men in same-sex relationships where they've had tests ahead of, treatment if they're going down the surrogacy route, and they found that there's an issue with them, that in itself, like, they just they never assumed, because they've not been trying in that way. And then where's the support, again, and I think there's such a disconnect. And we've actually got...
oh, sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say we've got an episode coming up about the kind of whole missing research in terms of the male reproductive health, and it's fascinating. There's a really significant gap in study of what causes all the issues, but also how it's looked after. And I think, again, another educational piece.
I was going to say as well, like you said, we started off talking about heterosexual couples, but even if it's two women, I think that in itself, it's a relationship, it's a partnership. You've got someone who's carrying the baby and someone that isn't. So whilst you might both be female or even non-binary, those emotions of maybe feeling sidelined or helpless and, all those sorts of things. And also just relationships, whoever's in them. And a fertility journey is a stressful situation. And whatever stress, look at everyone in lockdown is like, I'm going to kill my partner. Stress is not helpful for a relationship, and it's something that is a challenge, and you have to kind of really navigate that together. And if you're both going through emotional issues to do with fertility, but maybe you're not communicating, or maybe you're dealing with it in different ways, that can really put a strain on a relationship, which then I think amplifies those emotional issues that you're having. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. I mean, is that something that either you experienced or through the stories that you've heard, how did couples get over that and start communicating again?
Well, obviously, when you're trying to conceive, sex becomes a kind of real mission, and there's lots of sad stories about relationships breaking down and, having a real impact on your sex life. And that whole psychological piece is something that we've talked about in the past on the podcast, and we're talking about it more really in terms of how to reinvigorate your sex life when it does become, your app says, hey, you're ovulating, all that kind of pressures. But I think in terms of the work I'm doing with the formula now, we look at the impact it's having on your relationship, and look at when we look at all the impacts it has, we look at that and whether that is something that steps need to be taken in terms of communication, in terms of just making more effort between one another, so that the conversation isn't just about this, it's about the things that mattered before this happened. Because before you were trying to conceive, life, shit stuff still happened in life. It's just that it wasn't this, and you handled it then. And so it's kind of putting a bit of perspective onto it, that the relationship is going to be there through all of this, and the only way to kind of work it is to be in it together. And if that doesn't seem possible, then you need to get support. You need to get a way of navigating it better, and that might be counselling, that might be coaching. The work I do is for men and women, it's for individuals or couples. I think it's really, really important to not lose the relationship in all of this, because if the outcome isn't what you expect, and in the work that I do, there's a point where I ask my clients to draw a sketch of what their journey has looked like, and when we talk it through, and we look at what the emotional kind of repercussions are of all of that, and the times where I see people together in like maybe a bubble or not, and these are all things that we might not even actually allow ourselves to think about until someone like me goes, "Can you draw me a picture?" And then all of a sudden you've gone,
"Oh wow!"
Or there might be two different paths, and I think we totally overlook it, and so that's just something that needs to be. You need to. Not every relationship is going to make it through this type of situation, because of what it ultimately can mean. If a couple are childless not by choice, that can break a relationship, or it can make it even stronger. And I think
it's a bit like we said earlier about when you're on a personal journey and you're starting that process of it, and you're kind of getting your head around all these kinds of emotions you might feel, and with the work that you do, I think it's almost like couples kind of need to do that as well. They kind of need to say, okay, we're going on this journey together, and what happens if this happens? And I spoke to you on the phone today about how my partner and I have because of the work that I do with Parla, have investigated our fertility ahead of time, and have kind of
which I was like championing you for. Can't you say?
But I think it's obviously you could get down the road and things don't go the way that you hope, and that's not me to say, oh well, I'll be fine because I've got it all sorted. It doesn't work like that. But I do feel like we've had conversations that a couple might only have once they've been told there's an issue, and we've already gone, okay, so where do we stand on this, and where do we stand on that, and let's kind of and I do think there's a bit of the preconception care or preconception health, mental health and emotions is it's not just about diet and exercise and quitting smoking. Of course they're really important things, but I think that mental health and emotional well-being need to be part of that conversation as well, for both your personal mental health, but also I think and hope it would help couples navigate that, and relationships with families, which we've talked about, and friends. Not just the romantic relationship. I wrote a blog for Parla this week all about comparison, and it's something our community had asked for, because they were like, this is a huge issue. I can't be happy for my friends. I don't want to go to baby showers or babies' birthdays, and I think I'm sure it's something you've heard and even maybe experienced, because I think everyone says it, that pang you get.
And I think one of the things with all of that as well is this whole idea of boundaries and understanding the importance of you knowing what is right for you, and trusting your gut with all this kind of stuff, and deciding on what you are going to say to this person or duck out of from that. And a lot of the time we feel so guilty about all of this stuff, and the big thing is understanding what that guilt means, because guilt is ultimately about fairness, and you've not been unfair to such and such for not going to their baby shower. Really, they're still going to have a lovely baby shower, and yes, it's sad and it's unfair and it's not right that you feel that you can't handle this, because you, in an ideal world, want to share that lovely joy with your friend. But if you physically can't do it, then nobody can make you. This is your story and this is your experience. And I think as well, in what you say and tell people, like I was saying about that soundbite earlier, you don't have to tell people exactly what's going on. Talk to somebody, without a doubt, but it doesn't have to be those people that normally know everything. And I think that's a really hard thing for people when they are really open with different family members or friends, and people are sharing, and like you talk about the comparison and the whole world of social media and what happens when we see all this kind of stuff. I think you've just got to go with your gut, put these boundaries in place of what you can and can't manage, and this is all part of a process that you learn to do, because it's ultimately self-care. And that's what the work I do is about. It's creating a self-care strategy. It's a daily thing. It's not just like every now and again I'll be nice to myself, on mental health day I'll think about myself. It's every single day when you're dealing with something as huge as this, because it is huge. What do I need to do to get through the day? And you might feel that that's being over dramatic, but it's not. It's necessary.
Creating a safe space for yourself, and that's not a physical space necessarily, but it's like the bubble around yourself and what that. Sorry, I'm single man or woman with my puppy. So,
but you're going to bring up a little puppet, a little self.
But no, it's that you've got to create that safe space for yourself, and I think that boundaries. We had a question pop up actually about the 12-week thing, and even that is a good conversation. It's who are you telling? Maybe you do want to tell a few people in that time, but you don't have to tell everyone. And I think it's about, like you said, boundaries and not feeling obliged to keep people abreast of everything.
Yeah, totally. I had one of my clients recently who was really clear from the conversations that we'd had about who she was going to tell at work, and she previously told stuff that had meant that people were asking too much, and so she'd set out in her mind how she wanted to cope with it, and she actioned what she was going to do in terms of who she was going to tell. And then actually what happened was her treatment was brought forward much quicker, and so she went into it much quicker than she thought, because she'd had it all on hold with lockdown, and the work stress was instantly too much. But because of this conversation that she'd had, she was able to literally say, I can't do it. She was actually signed off from work, but it was all part of what she wanted to happen, because she thought about it ahead of time, because she'd had somebody suggesting it to her about how best to cope. And I think coping with this, because we have coping strategies, we might self-sabotage, we might immerse ourselves in something so that we're so busy that we can't do the other stuff. And coping strategies are one thing, as long as they are going to help us in the long term, not kind of mean that we're avoiding
they're not like
dealing with things properly.
It's actually,
exactly.
I think I'm just conscious of, we said we'd talk half an hour, and I said we'll probably go over, and I could chat to you all night, to be honest. But one thing that one thing that you touched on that I really wanted to cover, ironically, as we are doing this on social media, but I think social media and the comparison that comes with that, I wrote about that. We're no longer comparing ourselves to our circle of 10 friends. We're comparing ourselves to every woman we went to first school with, or strangers from the other side of the world, who can be a massive support and massive positive influence on one hand, and then on the other hand, and on the other days where you're not feeling strong, it can be super triggering, and it can be drive that comparison. And I know that you've got some thoughts on that as well. And again, we're always on social media, so it's ironically that we're saying there maybe could be negatives, but I think it's worth people considering that from a mental health perspective.
Every single person that I've talked to with my coaching hat on, and even with the podcast hat on, it comes up time and time again about the negative side of social media. And like we talked about, the kind of the boundaries and knowing what's right for you. Even people that seem to be having this amazing time on social media in this fertility space talk about having a detox. And I think you've got to either block accounts or unfollow people. I've had a client who was so down as a result of her situation and the groups that she was totally checking in with all the time, that we had to seriously discuss her. She was like addicted to them. And often what happens is you kind of go down that weird rabbit hole that makes you feel awful, because that is a safe feeling, rather than allowing yourself the space to not go down that route and see what happens if you don't. And oh, that feels like maybe a bit better, or I might be missing out, but actually I'm happier that I'm not. And I think you've got to be so aware of it. You've got to, and again, I go back to trusting your gut. If it doesn't feel right, that account that you follow, every time you look at it, it makes you feel this certain way, trust your gut and unfollow and stop looking, because that's the best indicator. You know, that's a physical thing that you're feeling and you can't ignore it. So,
and also,
just be really
even,
wary.
you know, even if we're not talking specifically about the TTC community online or fertility accounts,
No, it's everything.
Social media, you know, we all need a detox from it. We all need a break. You know, look, when we talk about that mind-body connection, the social media is a huge disruptor of that. And it's like anything. You've got to approach it mindfully. And I think we all don't. Like, we all are like, oh God, how did I lose that 10 minutes today? I was just scrolling nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not mindful. It's not nurturing our well-being. And I think it's definitely something that everyone needs to be aware of, but especially if you are going through a challenging time, like a fertility journey, you don't want to fall down a rabbit hole, because what starts off as, oh, I'm feeling quite inspired by this and this is uplifting me, 10 minutes later you're down a rabbit hole and suddenly comparison is coming in, and those negative emotions. So I think it's about being mindful, like you said, listening to your gut. And
I think if you need any more convincing, you just have to watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and then it will totally make you go, I'm never looking at a social media account again.
I know. Well, I my work is social media. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, I love it, but I'm scared to watch that program, because I think I'll just, you know, sell up and like move to like the Hebrides or something.
You might for like a day. My friend who also works in social media watched it and was like, it's really made me question my worth. But now she's back on it, and I think I just think it's a really interesting insight. And I think that the biggest thing in terms of mental health is that what we see is not what is really happening. It's obviously filtered. And, you know, I know we hear this conversation all the time, but I don't think you can say it enough in terms of how people show themselves on these platforms. That word show is really kind of poignant here. So
totally
take it from you.
And it is about, like we said, I think the biggest takeaway that from talking to you is just creating that safe space for yourself when you're on a fertility journey. You know, it's a journey. We call it a journey for a reason. And like you said, there's not an end point even, because the mental and emotional repercussions after you've had a child, maybe if you thought that was the ultimate goal and then that happens, and there's still a lot of trauma that you're dealing with. So it's a long journey. It's a sort of a lifelong journey for some people, and looking after yourself is the most important thing, isn't it?
Having the tools to be able to cope and know how you can self-protect and how you can work through different emotions it's such a valuable thing to learn. And I know since I've been in this place of learning this stuff and am now, you know, implementing it, I use it in all different ways in day to day. So I think it's a really valuable thing, and I think it's never too early to get this kind of support.
Yeah. Look, Natalie, thank you so much for your time. So
Pleasure.
As I said at the beginning, I'm sure most people know you, but if you're watching this and you don't, you can find Natalie at Fertility Poddy. You can listen to her podcast on Apple, the Fertility Podcast. You're kind of here, there, and everywhere at the moment, which I love. You're doing so many amazing things. You know, the Fertility Matters at Work is a huge initiative that I think loads of people would benefit from checking out. And we're really excited because you will be becoming, you know, part of the Parla community as well. When we launch our new app next week, Natalie is going to be one of the experts that you'll be able to communicate with through the app. You'll be able to, you know, have a chat with her. You'll be able to find out more about the services that she offers. You know, and I think people are going to benefit so much, because we've got incredible people on the app, from doctors and nutritionists and stuff like that. And then we've kind of got the mental health and emotional piece is really important for us. So we're so pleased that you, and I think Kate as well, is that, yeah, so we're so looking forward to that partnership and working with you moving forward.
Thank you. Well, like we've been saying, it's such an important part to know that you can work through this, but not to do it alone, ultimately.
Definitely. Be mindful, get your tools, get the community that makes you feel good, and you know, and look after yourself as you go through it.
And it can be like little steps. It doesn't have to be like this huge piece of work you've got to do on yourself. You can make tiny little changes. Like one of the really simple things that is part of the formula is a daily dance. It's literally whack the music up, whether you're driving to work, whether you're in your kitchen, and just blasting whatever for 3 minutes a day, singing, or even not if you can't sing, even if you're in the shower and you sing. But, you know, whatever it is, 3 or 4 minutes, there's all sorts of studies about the impact of music on your mental health. If that's one thing that you do in your day to day, then that's one little bit of self-care that you've now added into the mix.
No, do you know what? It's so funny because I try to work out every morning for my mental health. I feel better. And sometimes I can't be bothered to do the actual workout, but I've got the music on and I'm just sort of prancing around, and it just gets those endorphins going and brings you back.
Everybody has a song that takes them to a happy place. Yes, songs take us to sad places too, but sadness is ultimately about healing. So if you're listening to something and get sad, then that's taking you through to something else. But there's a hugely powerful thing about music.
Oh, well, look, I'm sure if your coaching advice involves dancing around your living room to your favourite song, then
really serious stuff.
I think that's amazing. That sounds wonderful. Natalie, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for letting me go over time. But we will put this as an IGTV on our Parla thing, and I guess Natalie will be able to share it with her. So if you're watching this back, thank you. And thanks to anyone that popped in today. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, Natalie. Speak to you soon.
Bye. Bye. Bye.